recording live. All right, so thank you so much for joining me, Mr. Greico. I appreciate it. So let's talk about the unfrozen or the assets President Biden signed to give to Afghanistan. I forgot my glasses. Thank you so much for joining me, sir. So how the current amount of $3.5 billion that's signed by President Biden on Friday to give it to Afghanistan, how these assets will reach Afghan people without any access to the Taliban?
Right. So I'm glad that you're asking this question because it's a very important topic, one that we have been working on at the Afghan American Chamber now for more than 4 or 5 months since the Taliban took over the country through military force. It's complicated, and I want the Afghan people, and especially the Afghan American community, to understand that there are over $9 billion of Afghan central bank foreign exchange reserves that were frozen by the United States and by the IMF, and technically through UN sanction as well. Of that $9 billion plus dollars, approximately $7 billion are located in the United States within the Central Bank of the United States, which is called the Federal Reserve Board of New York City. As a result of that $7 billion being in the US, that means that $2 billion of existing foreign exchange reserves are elsewhere, mostly in European banks and European capitals like Germany. As a result, the President of the United States can only make a decision on the assets that are under US government oversight and control, which is the $7 billion in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in our central bank structure here. The decision that he made on Friday will basically divide that pool of $7 billion into 2 accounts, 2 separate processes. $3.5 billion will be returned, I would expect fairly soon, to the Afghan people through direct payments back to the commercial banks of Afghanistan, where most of those dollars originated. So those were the accounts that were frozen after the Taliban takeover, that were frozen at the Afghan commercial banks. And those accounts are owned by Afghan business leaders. It could be a woman-owned NGO. It could be a family, individual beneficiary account that they had their life savings in that bank. All of that was frozen. Afghanistan has a very strong banking law that was signed many years ago. And since the Kabul bank scandal, there's been dramatic improvements in the banking industry inside Afghanistan. As a result, several Afghan top banks now, commercial banks, receive top ratings from the international banking community called Camel ratings for all of maintaining their assets and doing the incredibly difficult task of complying with all of the counterterrorism sanction and terror financing regime background checks that they have to for every deposit that they take in. So of that money that is in New York, the president's decided half of it will go back to Afghanistan, mostly returned to the Afghan commercial banks. I would expect this will be done on an incremental process instead of one large bulk transfer, and that money will slowly be repatriated to the Afghans who had that money in the bank and to their organizations as well. And so they will begin to get access to it. How soon, we don't know. The executive order doesn't direct a deadline on payments shall be returned, but the humanitarian crisis is what drove President Biden to make this decision, and the need to get liquidity back into the banking system and to get funding into the humanitarian response from the international donor community into the Afghan public right away. So I would expect you'll see that the president would like to set up a humanitarian fund that'll be composed of money from this $3.5 billion, the first section, and have that funding start to be implemented either through local NGOs, humanitarian organizations, international non-governmental organizations, or UN agencies or USAID, for example, which does undertake humanitarian programming in Afghanistan. Now, the second 3.5 billion, he has decided he tried to get agreement from the families of 9/11 victims to get them to agree to release all of the money, but they wouldn't. Their families were very divided. More than half the families, a majority of the families, wanted that money to go back to the Afghan people in a humanitarian fund that could be used to pay for humanitarian expenses, food, basic human needs, we call it, food, water, sanitation, other types of support. But a small percentage of American 9/11 families wanted their claim to that funding heard in the US court. And the president couldn't get them all the families to agree to it. So he did what he thought was politically expedient. He decided to throw the second half of the 3.5 billion court system of the United States in New York. This case is being heard, I believe, at the New York District Court, which is a federal court in New York, a very powerful court, and a court that is used to deciding on very tough issues like money that is being held throughout the world and different countries and for different reasons. So they are very sophisticated. The judges in this court system understand exactly what's going on, and whether or not President Biden has committed that 3.5 billion to the families or not, it's technically not his decision. That decision will be made in the courts by a judge who is going to ask to hear the positions of an Afghan representative. In this case, we have no recognized government. So who is going to represent the Afghan Taliban or the Afghan interim administration now in the courts in New York?
Sure. I don't want to break your thoughts, but you brought up a very good point, and maybe I can pose another question, and you can explain about 3.5 billion, because there are a lot of critics of how Biden divided the assets of Afghanistan, giving to these 9/11 family victims of 9/11, because most people say they are not the terrorists, were not Afghans, and why Afghanistan has to pay when Al-Qaeda leader was taken in Pakistan. Exactly. So tell me about this. How likely this decision will be implemented? As you say, some of the family will refuse to take this money because they wanted to go back to Afghanistan. How it will be implemented and given this fund to these families?
To the Afghan families in Afghanistan?
No, to the victims of, to families of victims of 9/11.
Yes.
So because the president sent the executive order, so as you were telling me, so how it will be implemented and how this family will be rewarded assets of a, like, let's say, poorest nation, because it triggered a lot of critics.
Yes, I agree that it's a complicated and very politically difficult decision. A court in our system will make that decision, not the president of the United States, even though the president has said things in the executive order. When it comes down to decisions of this nature that involve foreign countries and their rights and obligations under the law in the United States, this cannot be made as a political decision by the president. It should be made in our court of law. So I expect that there will be a decision from the court on who is going to represent the Afghan people's interests, because that money is not the Taliban's money. It is not the Central Bank of Afghanistan's money. That money is the foreign exchange reserves of the people of Afghanistan, who deposited that money or created those reserves and that funding from 20 years of representative elective government. No matter how ugly the elections were, no matter the fact that it's an Islamic republic, it matters not. They represented the people of Afghanistan, and they are due their rights to be able to have a say in the court system in the United States on the return of all of their assets, not just the 3.5 billion.
Sounds good. So about the assets given to Afghanistan, how it will impact Afghan economy, and it will stabilize the currency, Afghan currency, because right now it's not in good shape.
Yeah, once the money begins to be transferred. So let me be clear. Right now, approximately 2 billion out of the 9 billion total is going to be returned to the Afghan banks, commercial banks. When that money is returned, it will immediately help to stabilize the entire banking system. It will create capital and it will provide depositors their money back into their family accounts or to get access to a percentage initially. We don't want to create a run on the banking system that everybody withdraws the money as soon as it arrives and then the banks collapse after that. So I expect the Western donors will slowly migrate the funding back that they're owed, and that money will go into the commercial banks, and those commercial banks will notify depositors that they can now come and access it. That will have a broad effect, not only for the commercial banking system, but it will allow people to buy food, get access to health care that they can't afford right now, to get vaccines and so forth. It will have an immediate effect on the people. Second to that is the currency impact. We expect that the return of funds will immediately stabilize the currency and will begin to give the currency an ability to have a uniform, less inflation across the country. And so I know that many of our friends have emailed us that their food prices have gone up 50, 60% in different parts of the country. And that's impossible for people to be able to buy food, especially if you're poor. So we look to have a stabilization on the currency. We look to have it stabilize the economy, but we still need, the United Nations has estimated for the next 2 years, we need $8 billion for this crisis in order to stabilize the country and not cause a massive loss of life, which can bring political instability, migration, uncontrolled migration into neighboring countries. It'll cost a lot more in the long run than 8 billion if we don't get the international donor community to step up right now.
So what are the other options, money-wise, left for Afghanistan if this 3.5 billion will not be enough for Afghan people? And let's say the price was so expensive, Afghanistan, any Taliban are not recognized yet. There's a lot of international trade stalled and people lost businesses. What other options left for Afghanistan?
Well, I think, my feeling has been, and I think our chamber's board with me on this, that our most important thing right now is to save lives. People are dying. Young children. I'm getting reports from our businessmen in Afghanistan who have traveled all over the country that they're not seeing only children begging for food now. Now it's children that haven't eaten in days and are looking acutely malnourished and are on the verge of death. This is happening all over the country. People are selling their kidneys. There was a Tolo report last week of women lined up to give their kidneys for money so their children could eat. There's another Tolo report of fathers taking their daughters to markets to sell their children to get money. This is so inconceivable for the Americans to see this and to know that after 20 years of our economic and our development assistance that we're now in this position. This requires very desperate measures, not only for us in the donor community, but for the private sector as well. We have to put as our number one priority saving lives, and it means getting as much money and liquidity back into the system in Afghanistan as possible and getting that money to the people, to the poor, whether they would like to work for it through a voucher program that they can then redeem the vouchers at any business, and the donors will cash every voucher that a business supplies to them immediately. So we can we want to keep the market system going. Once markets begin to fail in Afghanistan, that's the last sign of a full-on famine. And if we have a famine condition, we can guarantee at least 20 to 30% of the population, which is now approximately 40 million people in Afghanistan, will seek to migrate. And if that happens, there will be an entirely different scenario within the region. We seek to avoid that. So our goal is to get liquidity back, focus on the money now. The president wasn't able to get a decision on the second 3.5 billion, so he sent it back to the courts, is the way I'm interpreting his executive order, and it's now up to the Afghan people to identify who they want to represent them in the New York court to get the rest of that money back. But there's another $2 billion in Europe. That should be returned now as well. Since the president's made this decision, we'd like to see that $2 billion also come back to Afghanistan in the form of a humanitarian trust fund that will be used to help the people, or in some other way that will prevent the Taliban. Under our sanctions law and under UN sanctions law, we can't have the Taliban touch any of the money that we're using. So the assistance that's going in now, mainly through the UN agencies, is almost all of it going directly to the Afghan people through local community groups and NGOs. It's not touching the central bank or the Taliban leadership at all. And we'll have to continue doing that as an implementing mechanism until the future is decided by the Afghan people on whether this is truly going to be their representative government or not.
As a last question, sir, so do you think Taliban blame that the government, their de facto authority or government is not recognized, and they blame the sanctions for whatever Afghans are suffering right now? But the country is already, they're ruling the country for 6 months. What options is there? Do you think this release of the assets is kind of like helping them get closer to be recognized by international world?
No, I can promise you that the number one reason that the president felt compelled to make this decision had nothing to do with the Taliban. It had to do with the absolutely unbelievable humanitarian situation on the ground inside Afghanistan. And the reports that he is seeing now of 22.5 million Afghans acutely malnourished, with the speed and the scale of the worsening crisis getting faster and larger than anyone anticipated. The Taliban overtook Afghanistan by force. They are not an elected government, and thus they're not recognized by any international government to be as a legitimate government. That'll be decided, I think, for the United States, maybe a long time. For other countries like Pakistan and Iran, Uzbekistan, the neighbors of Afghanistan, they may decide to recognize sooner, but I would caution them that you should be careful about making those kinds of decisions without international donor support and recognition as well. We want the women of Afghanistan, the young girls, to be educated and to have their human rights protected, not attacked. We've seen journalists that have been imprisoned in the last few weeks. We've seen journalists disappear. We've seen other people disappear. The report today about shootings in Kabul of Mr. Abdullah's chief of staff's son, or deputy chief of staff's son. These fights and these activities are still ongoing, and the donor community is paying attention to everything. The Taliban have to understand their best interest is in providing human rights protection and providing a pathway for Afghanistan to move forward economically. We would like nothing more as a chamber to be able to do trade and investment with Afghanistan. We think that is the future. Afghanistan is a trading economy, agriculturally based. We believe we can help Afghanistan to do that, and we want to help Afghanistan to do that. And we've been there for so long, since 2002, to do exactly that. And we've had a lot of success. But the Taliban takeover has set back the economy and the private sector community really badly.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. I think we covered everything. As you gave a great points, because